Before we start this week's podcast, I'd like to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsor, PensionBee. Now, PensionBee is one of the UK's leading online pension providers that helps consumers combine, contribute and withdraw from their pensions, all through the PensionBee web and mobile app. Now, you can sign up with the names of your old employers or providers in just 5 minutes, and PensionBee will help you find, transfer and combine your old forgotten about pension pots into a low-cost online pension plan. Now, these are managed by the likes of BlackRock, State Street Global Advisors, Legal & General or HSBC. Now, they have over 250,000 customers that have already signed up to combine their pensions with PensionBee, combining close to £1 billion into their plans. You can sign up to PensionBee today at pensionbee.com. You can also find out more information about PensionBee by reading my review on Money to the Masses. And as always, with investments, your capital is at risk.
Hello and welcome to episode 255 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Links. Damien, how you doing?
I'm good. Well, I'm recovering from the office visit we just had from, what was it?
A French Bulldog.
A puppy, I think it was. A French Bulldog. If you've seen our social media, go to Instagram and you will see the whirlwind that came into the office from one of the adjoining offices in Money to the Masses Towers. Well, they were looking after a puppy for about half an hour, and it ended up in our office, and well, you can imagine, sort of chaos ensued. So yeah, we're just recovering.
Work stopped for half an hour while we got
work stopped. Podcast got delayed, but no, good. Been another great week on the Money to the Masses website. We had loads of content. The Facebook community is flying now. I plug this every week because go on the Money to the Masses Facebook group and make sure you join. There is so much good content in there that even I am amazed by the quality of the answering of questions and the conversation that goes on. There's so many nuances that people won't realise about money that they will learn or remind themselves of. So, I mean, I'm enjoying it. It's inspiring content for us for the Money to the Masses website. So do make sure you'll join. It's a brilliant way of learning about all sorts of topics by osmosis. So it's a good way of enhancing any learning you're doing via Money to the Masses podcast or any other means.
No, it's been absolutely great watching it thrive, and I'm posting in there most days. And actually, I've managed to get my wife interested in money again because she gets alerts and she sees that I'm active in there, and she's joining in too. So it's great.
Yeah, and for those of you who left reviews this week on the podcast on iTunes or whatever other devices or stores that you use, make sure you email Lauren at moneytothemesses.com, which is the email address, to claim your free mug. Because a number of you have obviously done it, and the mug offer enticed a number of you who've been long-time listeners to leave reviews, but I'm not sure. I need to check with Lauren if she's had any emails from you, because you need to email us so we know where to send your mug. Otherwise we don't know by just looking at iTunes.
That's right. So what have we got coming up on this week's pod?
So this week's pod, I'm going to talk about coronaviruses and particularly the impact on stock market. So I'm not going to time date the podcast. You know I like to make this evergreen. So we're going to talk about the impact of epidemics on stock markets and whether this is a sort of event that could cause the stock market to collapse. Because as we make this podcast now, it's Friday at the moment, and the news headlines are sort of flying in about what's going on in China. And it's making some people nervous. There's a lot of, I think, information that's out there that is probably confusing, conflicting reports from China. So I want to make a bit of sense of that. I want to talk about Amazon, and we're going to do a piece on buying things cheaply from Amazon. So a short piece, probably at the end of the podcast. If you ever used Amazon, I can almost certainly say there's a couple of parts of it you didn't even know existed. So we're talking about it in the office, some cheap areas of the Amazon website where you can buy some heavily discounted products, almost up to 80% off. And the other piece I want to talk about is authorised push payment fraud. And more importantly, what it is and why some of the challenger banks, some of the big brands out there, are not part of a code where they sign up to protect their customers. More on that in that section.
Great. So what we're going to start with?
Let's go with the investment section first this week.
The coronavirus. Now, I've seen lots and lots written about this, and I struggled to pronounce it because it looks weird, because it's obviously one word, and actually when I broke down the word I thought it was something to do with the actual beer or something was going on.
For a man who no longer drinks, Andy, it's good to see your default is still to think of beer.
I've had a few coronaviruses in my past, I can tell you.
So the coronavirus, I mean, we don't need to add any more about what it is and what's going on, but the simple point is it's a flu-like virus that's started in China. and at the moment it's starting to spread around the world, and there's lots of different stories you're hearing about the fatality rates, or mortality rates I should say, and where it's being discovered next. So when this occurred, there's obviously issues for the country in question, which is China. We've had whole cities locked down. We were talking about in the office that you probably don't realise, if you go down the top 10 cities in China, just as a list by population, you're looking at the top cities having more than 20 million people in them. And to put it into context, if you add the top 4 cities in China, their population together, it exceeds that of the whole of the UK. So when you see these stories of them locking down a city with 20 million people in it, you get a sense of the scale of China when you realise that there are lots of cities with more than 1 million people in it. And if you do the equivalent in the UK, it's only, I think, London that actually has more than 1 million people in it as a city. So all the other cities, if you're going to look at places like Manchester, Bristol, Glasgow, cities like that, they're in the hundreds of thousands. So it is unusual to put a whole city in quarantine. I don't know quite how they achieve that. Shutting down motorways, airports, transport is how they are achieving it. But I mean, I don't know how that works in reality. So they're obviously worried about it. And the stock market took a bit of a wobble this week. And if you looked at the various different stock market indices, I alluded to it on the midweek market show, that if you went from east to west, the severity of what happened in the stock market seemed to diminish. Now in China, there was obviously a bit of a reaction. And why would that be? Why, if there's a virus, why would the market start to have a wobble? And the reason is because they're starting to become concerned that there'd be an economic impact. Now, there have been various reports I've seen to talk about the economic impact, say, for example, on China, if this outbreak escalated and the severity of the disease seemed to be increased. And it could knock sort of 1 to 2% of their gross domestic product, so knock their economic growth by sort of 1 or 2% in the next year or so. So it's obviously quite severe. So the reason why the stock market or stock investors get nervous is because if you start to reduce economic growth, it'll have an impact on profitability of companies. Certain sectors start to be overly affected. Transport companies will start to see their share price fall because people can't move around, etc., etc. Now, what I wanted to talk about is inspired by the newsletter that I send out every week to 80/20 investor members. And the one this week is focusing on the impact of epidemics in the past. So I'm going to share a bit of that, just again to give people a flavour of what I talk about week to week on something like 80/20 Investor. The newsletters are what people do love. It's only a small part of what we do on 80/20 Investor. There's the tools, the stop loss alerts, the research, the data, all these other parts. This is one part of it. And if you go back and look at past epidemics that we've had, so if you go back to, I'll list some of them. We had the HIV and AIDS epidemic in 1981. This is what they're called officially. We had the pneumonic plague in 1994. There's a whole list of them. I'm just naming some of them. There was SARS in 2003, swine flu in April 2009. There was MERS, which was the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome in 2013. We had an Ebola outbreak 2014, and there was one in October 2018, and there was a measles one in June 2019, and of course don't forget the Zika virus that was in January 2016. And now there's some research that's been carried out looking at the impact on the MSCI World Index. So that's the global stock market, an index giving you a broad look at the world stock markets and the impact on the stock market. Well, let me just say the movement of the stock market after these epidemics. After 1 month, if you looked across all of these different epidemics that I've named, the average fall, or actually the average was a gain after 1 month, was 0.4%. And if you look at after 6 months, it was about 8.5%. What it says is that people who are panicking that maybe this outbreak could be the thing that crashes the stock market, the evidence starts to suggest that it probably doesn't. It won't. The epidemics we had in the past don't particularly have a large effect on the stock market, of any effect. Now, there was one that does stand out if you look at the list, and that was the Ebola virus in October 2018.
What was special about that one then?
This one, you're talking about the stock market fell 7.5%. After 3 months, we were down nearly 14%. That is obviously a large number, and you could be forgiven for thinking, yeah, the Ebola virus. If you don't know what Ebola is, it's basically a disease which happens to essentially almost liquidate your organs, and so people die. It's got a high fatality rate, and it emanated from the Republic of Congo. And you can look at that and say, well, it's a severity, because the severity of a particular disease, therefore the market was more panicked, thinking it could go into a global pandemic. So it's an epidemic and pandemic are slightly different. I had to look this up. A pandemic is where you get an epidemic sustained in lots of different places. So it can actually sustain on its own in different countries. So We're not at that level with the current virus. So there is a danger, though, that people should always bear in mind when you look at statistics, and it's that correlation does not equal causation. So just because the market fell at that point, we might be sitting there thinking, well, as long as the virus's mortality rate doesn't increase, we shouldn't have anything to worry about. And the reality is, the reason the market fell in October 2018, if you've listened to any of our midweek market shows or follow 80/20 Investor or follow the markets yourself, you will know it was because the US Federal Reserve started tightening monetary policy. So they started unwinding all that money printing, and they started raising interest rates. And there's an argument they did it too aggressively too soon, and it caused the stock market to react negatively. And the market plummeted into December 24th of 2018, and that is exactly at the point where this Ebola outbreak is logged. So the 1st of October almost, they're saying, yep, that was when the Ebola outbreak was, but that was when the reaction to what the Fed was doing started. So it really had nothing to do with Ebola. Of course, if you had a pandemic around the world that was like Ebola, that was going to be incredibly severe, it would have a big impact on markets, because it's going to have a big impact on people's lives. So it would have an impact on markets. But the message of this piece is, if you're looking at your portfolio wondering and panicking that maybe this virus is going to cause the markets to collapse, if you look at the last week, we have seen a pullback in certain areas, but not in the US, and not too much in Europe. And it's all down to the headlines that come out. People start to overreact to negative headlines, and then when it says things are being contained, they tend to rebound and react positively. So the message is, you're going to have to wait and see, but it is unlikely, based on history, that an epidemic is going to have any material impact on the stock market. And the thing that is still driving markets at the moment is what's going on with the Federal Reserve and other global central banks. And I go on in the 80/20 Investor newsletter to look particularly at the other coronaviruses that have existed. So the SARS epidemic. Now, SARS and the current virus are quite linked because there's a similarity between them. So I go and look at that particular virus, and that was the SARS epidemic. So you could go and have a look at yourself. Was in April 2003, and of course the MERS one, which is another very similar virus, was in May 2013. And I look particularly at those periods and say, look, if we've got a similar virus, what did the market do? And as I said, I've taken an average. I'm not going to break down what happened in those particular cases, because that's for 80/20 Investor members. But there are some slight nuances about how the market can react, and you can get a negative reaction to a particular virus. And not to give too much away, but all you've got to think about is, where is the epicenter of that particular virus? And if you look at what happened in markets this week, and again, I'll give you a bit of a hint, look at China's stock market, compare it to what happened in America, you can see what is likely to happen if this virus escalates, which stock markets are going to probably have a negative impact more so than any others. Because as I say, as an average over history, epidemics don't tend to have any lasting impact, but stock markets aren't immune to a negative impact, but it tends to be more biased and more focused around the epicenter. But if you want to know more, then of course you can take out a free trial of 80/20 Investor.
Good stuff. So moving on to authorised push payment fraud. Some of the banks, certainly the challenger banks, aren't playing ball with this, and there's a code, isn't there?
Yeah, so just to give people the background, authorised push payment frauds or scams, they're called APP. I can't recall if we've gone through this before on the podcast in the past, but I just want to remind people what it is. It's where a scammer or a fraudster pretends to be, say, from your bank, or maybe if you're buying a house, they can pretend to be from your solicitor or something like that, and they encourage you to move money to a bank account that you think is safe, but it's actually the one that the fraudster controls. And so you end up sending your money to the wrong place. And I remember when Andy was very recently completing on his house purchase, Andy was absolutely
all over it.
all over it.
And freaking out.
Andy was freaking out for every minute that he didn't get the authorization or the confirmation, I should say, from his solicitor that the funds were in the account. Yeah. There was literally sweat pouring down Andy's head because of this. And I've heard many stories where people have lost holidays, etc., because fraudsters are very clever. They can end up mimicking email addresses, etc., and encouraging people to move money. Now, the problem was in the past, it was always seen as the victim's fault, that they'd sent the money, they'd pushed the money across. And that's where, obviously, it's the authorised push payment term comes from. We'll come back to Andy in a minute, because Andy did something that was very good, that limited the possibility that he was ever going to be a victim, even though he was fretting about it. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, what I want to tell people is, assuming that you have been a victim of this type of fraud, it's easy to become a victim. There's been, I think, over £1 billion worth of fraud that has been committed using this method. I mean, you have to be vigilant. Now, there has been a code of conduct that banks have signed up to called the Authorised Push Payment Code that was in May 2019 that says that banks have to, if they sign up and it's voluntary, this is the problem with a lot of financial services. They sit there and think they're going to fix problems by things being voluntary. These banks have to take steps to reimburse people if they're not to blame. And there's a whole other list of things they have to do in terms of trying to educate clients, trying to protect vulnerable clients in particular. But I just want to touch upon what would happen or what you should do if you become a victim. It's very likely that you could do a very whistle-stop tour of that. You obviously need to get in touch with your bank ASAP if you realise that you've sent money to somewhere you shouldn't, and hopefully they can try and stop the payment, and then you can report it.
Yeah, and on that as well, banks tend to have a specialist department almost for this exact thing. So often when you're going through the options and the menus, when you press a certain option, you'll almost be ushered through to a specialist quite quickly.
And the other thing then is to contact the bank where you thought the money, or where you sent the money. And the reason you would do that is obviously they may be able to stop the payment. And if you've acted quickly and told them and they don't act, you could actually make a complaint via the Financial Ombudsman Service ultimately if the problem isn't resolved, if they haven't acted quickly enough to stop the fraud occurring. Now, of course, there is the issue. If you've just pushed some money across and you don't know where the bank is because you don't know the sort code, then you can go and check sort codes online. If you Google sort code check and you go to bacs.co.uk's website, that'll be in the results. You can just put in the sort code and it will tell you the bank.
The branch and the location.
Yeah, and you can then ring up that bank. Let's say it's HSBC. You can contact HSBC and tell them what's happened, and hopefully they can try and stop it. Now, as I said, there was a code of conduct that was created in May last year that a whole load of banks signed up to, and it was partly because of the pressure of victims, through no obvious fault of their own, losing money and having to take it on the chin. And so I'm going to list the banks that actually signed up at the moment, and it's Bank of Scotland, Barclays, Kahoot, Cater Ellen, Co-op, First Direct, Halifax, HSBC, Intelligence Finance, Lloyds Bank, Marks and Spencer's Bank, Metro Bank, Nationwide Building Society, NatWest, Royal Bank of Scotland, Santander, Starling Bank and Ulster Bank. Now, if your bank is on that list, then you can be relieved, because that means that if something has happened and you've taken reasonable steps to believe that you've been a victim of fraud and it isn't your fault, then they should be able to reimburse you fairly quickly. Now, in order to uphold your side of the bargain, then you've had to pay attention to any warnings your banks have given regarding messages that are on screen when you set up and change payments. I don't know if you've ever seen recently, when you try and make a payment, it tells you to double check things, etc. You have to have a reasonable basis to believe that the person you're sending money to is the person you're expecting to pay money to, and that the business or person is legitimate and it's for goods and services that you were trying to buy. So the example I gave at the beginning, you're buying a house and somebody had maybe imitated your solicitor and it came from an email address that looked legitimate, then that would hold up, but you're going to have to provide evidence to be able to get that money reimbursed. But the point of this is I want to highlight those banks that aren't on it. So Bank of Ireland, Citibank, Clydesdale Bank, Danske Bank, First Trust Bank, Monzo, so big alarm bells, Monzo, N26, Tesco Bank, Virgin Money or the Yorkshire Bank, they will not reimburse money to you if it's been stolen by fraud under this code. Now, of course, this was highlighted online by Paul Lewis. Now, if you ever watch BBC Breakfast and things like that, listen to Radio 5, they've got their money box.
No, that's Radio 2.
Yeah, Radio.
I know that for a fact because I've turned old recently and I'm slowly working my way down the radio.
The funniest thing, I should know that because I've been on it. And so Paul Lewis runs the show. It's a very good show. So if you ever want to listen to something else other than the Money to the Masses podcast, it's obviously not as good as the Money to the Masses podcast. But he highlighted it in a series of tweets online and stated the banks that weren't part of it. And of course, you can imagine what happened. People started then poking Monzo, going, "Hey Monzo, why aren't you reimbursing your customers?" And of course, they've replied that they would, but they haven't yet signed up to the code and they will do later in the year. The point is, it's a voluntary code anyway, so if they're voluntarily reimbursing people, the point is, if your bank isn't signed up to the code, then the chances are they aren't bothered whether they're going to pay you or not. So I read out that list earlier, but do check the Payment Services Regulator's website for a list of the people who are on it. So you make sure that whether your bank is on it or not on it, because these things do change. TSB wasn't mentioned, but they do have their own guarantee anyway, which is the equivalent of this code, because don't forget the code is voluntary. So the point is, make sure you know what your bank is. The other thing is, this code only covers UK to UK transfers. So if you send money overseas, then unfortunately it doesn't fall under the code anyway.
Okay, so moving on to the last piece, and we're going to talk about Amazon and some additional features and parts of Amazon that people might not be aware of. And I already know what's coming. I don't think I'm aware of this because we were chatting in the office and I could hear you talking about various things to do with Amazon. I was like, I've never heard of that. No. So I'm going to learn.
Yeah, I seem to have Amazon at my door every day, it feels like. They seem to be always delivering parcels, and I mean, I don't particularly buy a lot from Amazon, but it is my default shop, and I'm ashamed to say it, I don't always support my local shops, and it's just the convenience of Amazon. But there are things about Amazon that you probably didn't realise. Two key things that I want to throw in here for people who use Amazon, that there's something called Amazon Outlet, and it's a section of the Amazon website where you can get up to 70-80% off of items. Now, it's a completely separate section, and it's money off of overstocked or clearance items. And I mean, I went on there, had a look around. It's done by section, and it's pretty much every section that's on the main website. So electronics, books, kitchen stuff, PC stuff, toys. And you go into it section by section, and you can find some pretty amazing discounts. So go and have a look at Amazon Outlet. I would give you a URL, but when I try a URL direct to the section, it doesn't seem to work. So just Google Amazon Outlet and you will find it. And I'm looking at it now, and it says find thousands of discounted and overstocked items. Now, the other area that you might want to look at is Amazon Warehouse. Now, I didn't know this existed either.
I knew they had a warehouse.
Yeah, they had a warehouse that obviously has had a lot of bad press about conditions, etc. But Amazon Warehouse is where returned goods are relisted and sold, and it means you can get up to 20% off. And very much like the outlet section, it's done by, you can browse by category if you want. And you can go on there, and I had to browse around, and there's all sorts of stuff on there. And the thing you have to bear in mind, of course, things can be damaged or could be repaired items, but they do state what they are, what the blemishes are on the product. And I went on there, for example, and I was looking at a cover for my Kindle, and I just happened to see it while I was researching for this podcast. And if you get a cover for the Kindle, it's £25, but you can get it on the Amazon Warehouse section for about £17. So you work out what that percentage discount is. That's pretty good. And let's be honest, it's a cover that is going to be battered when I chuck it in my bag anyway. So I thought that was pretty good. So if you're into Amazon, look at the Warehouse and Outlet. Camel. I always talk about this every so often. The website address is uk.camel.com. So it's in the animal. And if you sign up, what you can do, you can get price alerts on items, and you can track an item to see how its price moves up and down, because don't forget, things move up and down with supply and demand. So you can see if the price of something is a decent price or not, or if it's actually been a lot lower in the past, and you could just perhaps wait to buy that TV that you want and wait to get a price alert to know when it's got to a certain price, and then you can go and buy it. It's a clever tool. I think I particularly like it. But if you like that idea of tracking price history, there is another website called Price Spy. Now, I've never used this one. It logs the history of how much something costs from over 3,000 different retailers, apparently, including Argos, Amazon, eBay, and a lot of the supermarkets. So if you like to shop online, which most of us seem to do, then have a look at that website, which funny enough, gives us nicely circular, because one of the other reasons why in the modern society perhaps a virus might not have a bigger impact on stocks and things like that and the economy is because we shop online a lot. So if you have to go out and buy things and you were told that you started to restrict movement of people, or voluntarily they stopped going out so much, then being able to buy and sell things online, food, whatever it is, will mean that the economy keeps ticking over. So ironically, killing the high street might make us a little bit more immune to the effects of a virus, but there you go.
Good. And I'm talking about, you're saying about obviously buy local if you can at the start. I've got a little bit of a story on buying local. Over Christmas, I moved house, and I seemed to be going to the hardware shop every other day, picking up bits and pieces for the new house. And I happened to mention to the lady, and I know her quite well in the village, who runs the shop, and I said, look, I can buy all this stuff, I'm really sorry to say, a lot cheaper online, but I'm here to support you, and because it's convenient, you're local. And she said, that's really nice that you've said that and you chose me. I'll add a 10% discount on this. So if you're honest and you say to your retailer, look, I'm choosing to use you over and above someone else, you might find that they'll thank you in terms of giving you a little bit of a discount.
I like that. I think that's really good. And that's just reminded me of something I probably mentioned about 200 podcasts ago, another add-on for Amazon. It basically works with a way to support your local bookshops via Amazon through an add-on for Chrome. So if you go to bookindie.com and you download the extension, what happens, you then just surf Amazon like you would do, and maybe you're looking for a book by Stephen King or something like that. And when you go and find it on Amazon, automatically next to the price of the book will be another little box that looks just like it's part of the Amazon website that tells you the price from your local bookstore and how far away that bookstore is. So I've just done it for Stephen King's It, and it's told me I can get the same book locally, and it tells me the price. So if you do that, you can go through there and then you could go and buy it from that bookstore. And sometimes you might even be able to get it cheaper, but you are supporting your local bookstores, which we all need to do. So I like that. And I've just remembered, before we finish, Andy, I was talking about something amazing that you did on the APP fraud, but didn't come back to. There's probably people out there going, they've forgotten it, but I've just remembered. Yeah. So you can take this one away.
Yeah, so I spoke to my solicitor. Unfortunately, it was via text and email, which is why it was slightly frustrating in the end. But essentially, I sent just a small taster sum. So obviously, when we move house, it's a big pot of money you've got to hand over to your solicitor, and you've got to trust that is secure and it works online. So I just sent a couple of £100 to start with. You could do even less if you wanted. You could do 50, but I was pretty confident I had the right details. I sent a couple of £100, and I was not going to send the remaining balance until I'd had confirmation that was with them and it was secure. And the sweat and the frustration was just because it took a couple of days to sort of get that confirmation. It slowed down the process, but I'd rather that than obviously lose.
Yeah, and in reality, it shouldn't have done that. That should have been a case your solicitor should have just gone, yep, bingo, it's in there. That's their fault. You could send £1 if you wanted,
yeah,
but you should send over money. And if somebody is going to be genuine and be helpful, they should be able to confirm for you that the money. I know they probably just sit there and get frustrated at the fact that why don't you just send over the full amount? But explaining what APP fraud is, which they should know about, because there's been plenty of cases where solicitors, etc., have been mimicked to allow the fraud to occur. They should be a little bit more compliant. But anyway, that's it for this week, Andy.
That's it. So if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien@moneytothemasses.com. On Twitter, it's @moneytothemasses with the number 2. Don't forget, if you have left us a review, thank you so much. Get in touch with Lauren. It's Lauren@moneytothemasses.com to claim your mug. Make sure you send a screenshot or claim whichever one is your review.
Actually, I will go off piece, and Lauren's not in the room at the moment, otherwise she'd probably throw something at me. I'll extend that for one more week. We'll do it for another week, okay, because it's been a while since we've given away some mugs, and I'd love to see some people happy getting mugs and appearing on our mug wall of fame. So I'll do that for one more week. We'll do it and then we'll close it down again, because obviously we can't have it open forever. Lauren is lurking in the background. I've got my back to her, but I know I can feel her eyes on me. We'll do it for one more week.
Good. Until next time.
Until next time.